At a fundraiser where America's conservative elite gathered to forge a path to victory, former Vice President Mike Pence delivers a public condemnation of current Vice President J.D. Vance, an attack so sudden and so vicious it brings the entire room to a dead stop. But as the tension becomes unbearable, J.D. Vance answers with a single, devastating question, a whisper that shatters Pence's composure and leaves the powerful audience breathless. What he said would not just win the night. It would draw a battle line through the soul of the Republican Party. It was supposed to be a night of unity, a carefully choreographed display of strength. The Grand Washington Ballroom was a sea of black ties and shimmering gowns, a universe of power brokers and kingmakers assembled beneath a constellation of crystal chandeliers. The air, thick with the scent of orchids and expensive cologne, hummed with the low murmur of influence. President Donald Trump had just concluded his keynote address, leaving the stage to a roar of applause that felt less like approval and more like worship. Now, the room belonged to his successor, the man he had chosen to carry the torch, Vice President J.D. Vance. But before Vance could even reach the podium, before the applause had fully faded, a voice cut through the air. It wasn't amplified, not at first, but it had the sharp, cold clarity of breaking ice. It was Mike Pence. "Before we listen to the echo," Pence said, rising from his seat at a table near the front, "perhaps we should hear from a voice." He walked toward the stage, not with an invitation but with the grim determination of a man on a mission. The room fell silent. The polite chatter died in 1,000 throats. Forks hovered over plates of untouched filet mignon. Every senator, every donor, every journalist felt the sudden, chilling drop in temperature. J.D. Vance stopped. He was just a few feet from the lectern, one hand slightly raised to acknowledge the crowd. He didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a statue in the eye of a gathering storm, his posture a study in stillness. The cameras, which had been panning across the smiling crowd, all swiveled in unison, a herd of black-lensed beasts finding their target. Pence reached a secondary microphone set for introductions, his hand gripping it as if it were a weapon. He smirked, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We all know J.D. is a good soldier," he began, his voice now booming through the speakers, laced with a condescending warmth that was more insulting than any shout. "He follows orders. He recites the words he is given. But leadership requires a soul of your own." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was audible, a physical wave of shock. This wasn't a debate, it was an execution. Secret Service agents near the stage exchanged tense, confused glances. This was not on the program. This was not supposed to happen. Pence's eyes locked onto Vance's back. "You have conviction, J.D.," he continued, twisting the word into an insult. "But it's borrowed conviction. You stand on a stage you did not build, speaking a truth you did not earn." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief. Even the city traffic outside seemed to have ceased. In that moment, the only sound was the frantic, silent clicking of a dozen press cameras. Then slowly, deliberately, J.D. Vance turned. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. His face was a mask of calm composure, his eyes holding Pence's gaze without a flicker of emotion. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood at the main podium. He adjusted the microphone, his movements unhurried, almost serene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He leaned in, and the words that came out were not a shout, but a whisper, a calm, chilling query that carried across the hushed room with the force of a thunderclap. And with that single question, the carefully constructed world of conservative politics began to fracture. J.D. Vance looked Mike Pence directly in the eye, his voice low but piercing, each syllable perfectly articulated. "Mike," he said, the name hanging in the air alone for a moment. "If my voice is an echo of a great man, what is yours? The silence of a man who ran, or the whisper of the enemies you now serve?" The words landed not like a punch, but like the quiet, inescapable chill of a winter frost. A gasp went through the room again, but this time it was different. It was sharper, more profound. It was the sound of 100 daggers of realization hitting their mark. Someone in the back, a donor from Texas, dropped his fork. It clattered against his plate with a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence. Mike Pence's face, which had been a carefully constructed mask of righteous authority, began to crumble. The confident smirk evaporated, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes, which had been narrowed with predatory focus, widened almost imperceptibly. He had walked onto that stage expecting a fight, but he had prepared for a brawler. He had not prepared for a surgeon. To understand the devastating precision of that question, you have to understand the journey of the man who asked it. J.D. Vance was not a product of this world, of the grand Washington ballroom with its gilded ceilings and its unspoken rules of engagement. He was an emissary from a different America, a forgotten America. He was born of the Appalachian hills and forged in the decaying steel towns of the Rust Belt, a land of quiet dignity and loud desperation. His childhood was not one of political fundraisers and summer homes in the Hamptons. It was a tapestry woven with the threads of poverty, addiction, and the fierce, complicated love of a family clinging to the edge. He was a man who understood the scent of a factory town after the factory has closed, the hollow look in the eyes of men who had built a nation with their hands and were then told they were obsolete. He had seen the hope drain from entire communities, leaving behind a residue of resentment and a deep, gnawing sense that the people in rooms like this one, the people who spoke in polished tones about global markets and progressive futures, had left them behind to die. This was the world that had made him. It was a world Mike Pence knew only from briefing papers and poll numbers. Pence was the consummate insider, a man molded by the institutions of power. His path was a straight, predictable line: talk radio host, congressman, governor, vice president. He spoke the language of the establishment Republican Party fluently. He was a man of faith, discipline, and unwavering political decorum. He was safe. He was reliable. He was, to his core, a creature of the system. Vance was a creature of the chaos the system had created. He had escaped it through the sheer force of his will and the grace of a few good people. The Marine Corps had given him discipline. Yale Law School had given him a new language, the language of the elite, which he learned to speak with the chilling precision of a spy who had infiltrated enemy territory. He had walked among them, in the hallowed halls of the Ivy League and the gleaming towers of Silicon Valley. He understood their arguments, their assumptions, their quiet condescension toward the world he came from. And he had never, for 1 second, forgotten the faces of the people he'd left behind. His journey to Donald Trump's side was not one of blind ambition, as his critics claimed. It was a pilgrimage. He had at first been a skeptic. His intellectual training at Yale had taught him to distrust a force as raw, as disruptive as Trump. But then he listened, not to the media's interpretation, but to the voices of the people at Trump's rallies. And in their cheers, he heard the echoes of his own childhood. He heard the righteous anger of the dispossessed, the desperate plea of the forgotten. He realized that Donald Trump was not just a politician. He was a vessel for the pain of the people he loved. While Mike Pence stood beside Trump with the posture of a loyal but slightly uncomfortable subordinate, Vance saw something different. He saw a warrior. He saw a man who, for all his flaws, was willing to fight for the people the establishment of both parties had discarded. His loyalty, therefore, was not transactional. It was primal. It was the loyalty of a son to a father who had finally given his family a voice. So when Mike Pence stood on that stage and called him an echo, a puppet, he wasn't just insulting J.D. Vance. He was insulting the entire world that Vance represented. He was dismissing the pain of Appalachia, the anger of the Rust Belt, the quiet despair of millions of Americans as nothing more than a borrowed talking point. In Pence's eyes, these people were not a constituency to be served. They were a political force to be managed, and now to be discarded in the name of a return to civility. That was the context for the question that now hung in the air, unanswered. It was not a clever retort crafted by a speechwriter. It was the distillation of a lifetime of experience. It was the voice of the outsider, the survivor, the prodigal son who had returned not to beg for a seat at the table, but to flip the table over. He was asking Pence to account for his choices, not to the party bosses or the donors, but to the very people whose trust had put him on that stage in the first place. Pence's lips parted as if to form a response, but no words came. His mind, a fine-tuned machine for political calculation, was spinning, searching for the right phrase, the pre-approved comeback. But there was none. He had been so focused on his attack, on the caricature of Vance as a mindless puppet that he had forgotten the man himself. He had forgotten the quiet, observant intelligence in his eyes, the steel in his spine that had been forged not in Washington, D.C., but in the heart of the American struggle. He had poked a bear he thought was sedated, and now, as he stared into Vance's unblinking gaze, he was beginning to realize with a dawning, sickening horror that the bear was wide awake. The silence in the grand Washington ballroom was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living entity. It pressed in on Mike Pence from all sides, amplifying the heat of the stage lights on his forehead, magnifying the hundreds of pairs of eyes that were now fixed on him, not with expectation, but with a cold, forensic curiosity. He could feel their judgment. He could feel the tectonic plates of power shifting beneath his feet. His jaw, a muscle he had trained for decades to remain firm and resolute, tightened into a knot of brittle pride. He had come here tonight to deliver a sermon on leadership, to position himself as the conscience of the conservative movement. And with a single, whispered question, J.D. Vance had turned the pulpit into a witness stand. To understand the profound paralysis that gripped Mike Pence in that moment, you must first understand the careful, deliberate architecture of his life. He was a man built of right angles and solid certainties. From his earliest days in Indiana, his world was defined by clear, unambiguous lines, between right and wrong, between the sacred and the profane, between order and chaos. He was a product of the heartland's steady, unyielding faith, faith in God, faith in the Constitution, and faith in the fundamental decency of American institutions. His ambition was not a raging fire, but a slow, patient, kiln-like heat. He didn't seek to conquer the world of politics. He sought to ascend within it, step by predictable step, earning his place through discipline, piety, and an unwavering commitment to conservative principle. He was the anti-Trump. When Donald Trump descended that golden escalator in 2015, a chaotic force of nature disrupting every established norm, Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana, a man known for his calm demeanor and his socially conservative bona fides. He represented everything the establishment GOP told itself it was: principled, polite, and predictable. The alliance between the two men was not born of ideological kinship. It was a strategic necessity. Trump was the lightning, a raw and unpredictable force that had tapped into the nation's rage. Pence was the lightning rod, the grounding wire designed to reassure the party elders, the evangelicals, and the donor class that the storm could be contained, that the revolution would, in the end, be televised with respectable commentary. For 4 years, he played his role to perfection. He was the picture of stoic loyalty. He stood behind the president at 1,000 rallies, his head nodding in solemn agreement, his expression a carefully curated mask of unwavering support. He was the calm voice in chaotic meetings, the steady hand on the tiller, the man who could translate Trump's fiery, instinct-driven decrees into the bland, acceptable language of Washington policy. In his own mind, he was not a follower. He was a shepherd. He believed he was guiding this populist energy, channeling its power for good while protecting the institutions he held sacred from its most destructive impulses. He saw himself as the guardian of conservatism's soul, the man who would ensure that after the storm of Trump had passed, the foundations of the republic would still be standing, perhaps even stronger than before. But there was a fatal flaw in his calculation. He mistook the movement for the man. He believed the energy was something he could manage, something he could eventually inherit and reshape in his own, more dignified image. He never truly understood that the millions of people wearing red hats were not cheering for tax cuts or judicial appointments. They were cheering for the warrior who had finally given them a voice, the man who fought for them without apology. They were not loyal to the Republican Party. They were loyal to the man who had taken a sledgehammer to the establishment of both parties. The breaking point, when it came, was not a slow erosion but a seismic fracture. January 6th. For Mike Pence, it was the ultimate test of his identity. On one side was the president, the movement, the millions of voters who believed the election had been stolen and who were now begging him to be their champion. On the other was the Constitution, the institution of Congress, and the entire weight of the Washington establishment, the very world he had spent his life preparing to lead. His choice in his mind was clear. It was a choice for order over chaos, for principle over populism, for the written law over the will of the people. As he saw it, he was saving the republic from tyranny. But the people who had voted for him saw something else entirely. They saw a man who, at the moment of maximum pressure, when the fight was truly joined, chose to stand not with them, but with the very swamp they had sent him to drain. They saw him accept the back-patting praise of the same media that had spent 4 years calling them deplorable. They saw him embrace the language of his political enemies, and they saw it as the ultimate betrayal. The days and weeks that followed cemented his path. The praise he received from the mainstream media, from Democrats, from the dwindling caucus of never-Trump Republicans, was a seductive poison. For the first time in his political life, the people who had always scorned him as a religious fundamentalist were now hailing him as a patriot, a hero, a man of courage. He read the editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post that lauded his bravery. He listened to the commentators on CNN who spoke his name with a newfound reverence, and he began to believe them. He started to see himself as they saw him, a martyr for democracy, a lonely man of principle who had stood against the mob. He mistook the applause of his enemies for the judgment of history. This was the man who walked into the grand Washington ballroom tonight. He was no longer just Mike Pence, the former vice president. He was the protagonist of his own heroic narrative. And in that narrative, J.D. Vance was a villain, a symbol of the blind, unthinking loyalty he had so courageously rejected. Vance's unwavering defense of Trump was a constant, implicit rebuke of Pence's defining moment. For Pence's choice to be seen as heroic, Vance's had to be seen as sycophantic. He needed to frame Vance as a puppet, an echo, to validate his own claim to principled leadership. His attack tonight was not just a political tactic. It was an act of desperate self-justification. It was the only way to silence the nagging voice in the back of his own mind that whispered he had not been a hero, but a coward who had run from the fight the moment it got too hard. And now, staring into Vance's calm, knowing eyes, the entire narrative was collapsing. The question Vance had asked was not about politics, it was about allegiance. It cut through all the self-serving justifications and laid the truth bare. It asked him to declare in front of the entire world whose side he was truly on. And in the crushing, deafening silence, Mike Pence had no answer. Because he was finally being forced to confront the terrifying possibility that, in his quest to save his own soul, he had sold it. Pence's face, a landscape usually governed by disciplined composure, became a battlefield of conflicting emotions. A flush of crimson crept up his neck, a tide of anger and embarrassment rising against the pale shore of his skin. His lips, pressed into a thin, white line, trembled almost imperceptibly. He opened his mouth, a reflexive action to reclaim control, to launch the counterassault he had surely rehearsed in his mind. But the words caught in his throat, a logjam of pride and panic. The air in his lungs felt thick and useless. He was a man drowning in plain sight, suffocated by a silence of his own making. J.D. Vance didn't press his advantage. He didn't smirk or lean forward with aggression. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, allowing the weight of his question to do the work. He was a hunter who had set a perfect snare and was now content to watch his quarry exhaust itself. The contrast between the two men was stark, almost biblical. Pence, rigid and flustered, radiating a desperate, crackling energy. Vance, calm and centered, a study in quiet, immovable strength. Then Vance spoke again. His voice never rose. It remained at that same, low, conversational pitch, yet it sliced through the tension like a scalpel through flesh. I stood with a president who was relentlessly attacked by the very people who now invite you to their dinner parties, Mike. Every word was a hammer blow, delivered with the soft, cushioned impact of a velvet mallet. The senators in the audience leaned forward, their faces a mixture of shock and rapt attention. Reporters who had been lazily taking notes were now typing with a feverish intensity, their fingers flying across tiny keyboards, trying to capture every syllable. "You speak of a soul," Vance continued, taking a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them by a fraction. "But what becomes of a soul when it values the approval of its enemies more than the loyalty of its friends? You ran from the fight the moment the arrows started flying, right into the arms of the archers. Pence finally found his voice, but it was not the commanding, resonant baritone the world knew. It was a strained, reedy thing, thin and brittle. "That's a lie," he managed, the words sounding weak and defensive in the cavernous room. "I upheld my oath to the Constitution." "No one is questioning your oath to a document," Vance countered instantly, his tone sharp but still controlled. "We are questioning your oath to the people who trusted you. You talk about leadership. Is it leadership to abandon your soldiers on the battlefield because the enemy promises you a comfortable retirement?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a sound of assent, of recognition. Vance had just articulated the very betrayal that millions of voters felt but could never put into words so precisely. He was giving voice to their grief. "You call me a puppet," Vance said, his eyes scanning the faces in the front row before returning to Pence. "But I have never seen a man more controlled by the strings of his own fear. You obeyed your fear of the media. You obeyed your fear of being cast out by the Washington elite. I obeyed my conscience. And my conscience tells me you never, ever stabbed the man in the back who put you on the stage in the first place." Pence's lips trembled again. He looked desperately out at the audience, as if searching for an ally, a friendly face, a nod of support. But he found none. He saw only cold, appraising stares. He saw donors who had written him million-dollar checks now looking at him as if he were a bad investment. He saw former colleagues, men who had served with him in Congress, now studying the crystal pattern on their water glasses with intense focus, refusing to meet his gaze. In that moment he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The applause started quietly. It wasn't the thunderous, obligatory roar of a political rally. It began with a single person, a woman in the third row, a county chairperson from Michigan. She began to clap slowly, deliberately. Then another joined her and another. It was hesitant at first, then it grew, not into a wave but into a steady, rising tide of support for Vance. It was the sound of a silent majority finding its voice. From the wings of the stage, where he had been watching the entire exchange on a monitor, President Donald Trump allowed himself a small, grim nod of satisfaction. He didn't smile. The moment was too grave for that. But his eyes, fixed on the screen, held a look of vindicated pride. He had chosen his new vice president not for his polish, but for his spine. And tonight, that spine was proving to be made of pure, unbending steel. The war of words was no longer just words. It was a schism, a public and brutal divorce. Pence, seeing the room turn against him, tried to retreat. He took a half-step back from the microphone, a gesture of surrender. He wanted to escape the spotlight, to melt back into the anonymity of the crowd. But J.D. Vance was not finished with him. He took another step forward, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in closer to hang on his every word. "You want to talk about conviction, Mike?" Vance asked, the question a quiet, lethal challenge. "Where was your conviction when our cities were burning in the summer of 2020? When the media was spewing lies day and night, calling every patriot a racist? Where were you?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "I'll tell you where you were. You were hiding behind focus-grouped press releases and praying for it all to go away. Real Americans were losing their businesses, losing their homes, losing their country. And you were silent. The live stream viewer count, which had been steady, suddenly surged past 2 million. Social media was a wildfire of commentary. The confrontation had gone from a ballroom drama to a national event in the space of 3 minutes. Pence, his back now almost completely to the audience, turned slightly. "You don't understand the pressures of that office," he muttered, his voice raspy, defeated. "No," Vance's voice cut back, sharp as a shard of glass. "You don't understand the meaning of standing your ground." He turned his body slightly, addressing not just Pence but the entire room, the entire country watching at home. "Leadership isn't about avoiding criticism. It isn't about seeking applause from the editorial board of the New York Times. It's about choosing what is right, even when it costs you everything. It's about being willing to be hated by the right people." He glanced back at Pence, his expression not of anger, but of something closer to pity. "That's a lesson you seem to have unlearned the moment you traded your integrity for a favorable headline." Pence's face, already pale, drained of its remaining color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, the ghost of the man he used to be. And then Vance delivered the final, devastating blow, a sentence that would be quoted and replayed for years to come. You were Donald Trump's vice president, Mike. Now, you're a footnote in a history book you allowed the Democrats to write for you. At that moment, Mike Pence looked like a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that his political career had just ended. The room was not just stunned. It felt wounded, as if everyone present had just witnessed a great and terrible fall. And in the center of it all stood J.D. Vance, not as a victor, but as a reluctant executioner who had done what had to be done. The applause had subsided, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. The air in the ballroom was charged with the aftermath of the explosion, filled with the invisible shrapnel of broken allegiances and shattered reputations. People weren't whispering. They were thinking. They were processing. They were reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the man standing frozen by the secondary microphone. Mike Pence stood as if rooted to the spot, a statue of regret. His eyes, which had been darting around the room, now stared blankly at the deep red carpet, as if the intricate pattern held some answer, some escape from the wreckage of the last 5 minutes. He had walked into this room a respected elder statesman, the would-be conscience of a movement. He was now an outcast, exposed and isolated in a room full of his former allies. J.D. Vance walked slowly past him, his footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He didn't spare Pence a glance. His focus was now on the crowd, on the cameras, on the millions of people watching beyond the ballroom walls. He reached the podium and placed his hands on either side of it, not to steady himself, but to ground himself, to connect with the gravity of the moment. "This isn't about personal animosity," Vance said, his voice steady, imbued with a solemnity that commanded attention. "This is about an infection that has been allowed to fester in the heart of our party for too long, an infection of cowardice that masquerades as civility." He looked directly into the main camera, his gaze intense, forging a direct connection with every person watching on a screen. "The truth is, some men are given the honor of wearing the title of vice president, but they treat the office not as a sacred trust, but as a stepping stone, a bargaining chip to secure their own future, to keep their invitations to the right parties in Georgetown." Pence's jaw clenched. The reference was unmistakable. His eyes darted towards a small, powerful group of donors sitting at a table to his left. He saw one of them, a billionaire industrialist who had funded his gubernatorial campaigns, slowly shake his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. Another had already turned his chair slightly, physically angling himself away from Pence, a small but brutal act of public disassociation. "You betrayed more than a man," J.D. continued, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a prosecutor laying out his final, irrefutable argument. "You betrayed every single voter who stood in line for hours, who put a sign in their yard, who believed you when you said you would fight for them. They didn't send you to Washington to win the approval of the media. They sent you to be their voice. And when their voice needed to be its loudest, you chose to be silent." A woman in the audience, seated near the front, began to cry. Not loudly, but with the quiet, heartbreaking sobs of someone whose deepest fears had just been spoken aloud. She was a small business owner from Pennsylvania whose restaurant had been forced to close during the lockdowns. She remembered watching Mike Pence on television during that time, offering carefully worded statements that said nothing, that offered no hope, that did nothing to fight for people like her. Vance's words weren't just political rhetoric to her. They were a validation of her pain. "This party, this movement is not perfect," Vance said, turning his attention back to the people in the room, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "We are flawed. We make mistakes. But what we cannot afford, what we must not tolerate, are traitors from within. We don't need any more carefully polished men who run from the fight. We need fighters. And I, for one, will not stand by and let history be rewritten by the men who fled the battlefield." The room erupted. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a spontaneous, overwhelming roar of approval. It was a catharsis. People leaped to their feet, their applause a thunderous wave of sound that shook the crystal chandeliers. Mike Pence visibly shrank under the sonic assault. It was the sound of his own political obituary being written in real time. He took a shaky breath, a last desperate attempt to reclaim some sliver of dignity. His voice, when he spoke, cracked with the strain. "You think you know," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Vance. "You weren't in the room, you don't know the pressure, the chaos." "I know what loyalty is," Vance interrupted, his voice cutting through the applause and silencing it instantly. The hall froze once more. Pence's hand trembled more violently now. "You're a child in this arena. JD, you rode into power on President Trump's coattails. I helped build that legacy. You're just walking in shoes you didn't earn." A thin, hard line formed on JD's lips. He paused for a beat, letting Pence's accusation hang in the air, letting its petty bitterness expose itself. Then he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet every person in the room heard it as if it had been shouted from the heavens. "The difference between you and me, Mike, is that I never once considered spitting on the man who gave me the shoes." A low groan of empathetic pain echoed across the room. It was over. Everyone knew it. Vance stepped forward again, his movements now imbued with a new, undeniable authority. He was no longer just the vice president, he was the leader of the room. "You act as if you carried some great burden," he said, his voice laced with cold contempt. "But when the moment of truth arrived, you handed the pen to the enemy and let them write the story. You let them call us traitors. You let them call us insurrectionists. You validated every lie they ever told about us, all for a pat on the head." A few older men in the audience, veterans by the look of their posture and the pins on their lapels, nodded in grim agreement. One of them, wearing a hat that said Vietnam Veteran, slowly, painfully, got to his feet and began to clap, alone at first, his solitary applause a stark, powerful endorsement. Then J.D. Vance did something no one expected. He paused, turned slightly, and reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a slim, manila folder. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This," he said, holding the folder up for all to see, "is a copy of a series of emails and text messages between the office of former Vice President Pence and several well-funded, Democrat-aligned political action committees." He let that sink in. The dates are what's important. They begin just 2 weeks after January 6th. Long before Mr. Pence told the American people he was praying for wisdom on his future, he was already negotiating the terms of his surrender, including speaking fees and commitments for a future presidential run. The room gasped as one. A journalist in the front row, a veteran of the White House press corps, literally jumped to his feet to get a better angle for a photo, his camera flashing like a strobe light. Pence's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. That's classified information," he barked, his voice raw with panic. JD replied, his tone as cold and calm as a frozen lake. "Not anymore. The relevant sections were declassified and cleared by the appropriate channels last night. I made sure of it." He looked at Pence. "You see, Mike, transparency isn't betrayal, scheming with the opposition while pretending to be a man of principle. That is." He walked to the podium and laid the folder down with a soft, final thud. "This isn't an act of revenge," Vance said, his voice now filled with a weary sadness. "It's a revelation. The people who trusted you, who prayed for you, deserve to know who you truly became the moment you thought the cameras were off." Pence's shoulders slumped in utter final defeat. He had no words. He had no defense. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the silence of a tomb. Even President Trump, still watching from the wings, turned to a nearby aide and whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and grim finality, "He just ended him." The truth had landed. And in that devastating, clarifying moment, Mike Pence finally understood. He hadn't just insulted J.D. Vance. He had awakened a force he never knew existed. Outside the grand Washington ballroom, the world was exploding. News vans, which had been parked in neat, orderly lines along the curb, now resembled a chaotic swarm of predators that had caught the scent of blood. Reporters stood bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of camera lights, speaking in breathless, urgent tones into microphones, their words tumbling over one another in a race to define the moment. Breaking news chyrons scrolled across the bottom of every television screen in America, stark white letters on a blood-red banner. Pence career in tatters after Vance revelation. Trump's VP, ACCUSCS, former VP of betrayal. The GOP civil war is here. Twitter was no longer a platform. It was a digital supernova. The hashtags Pence exposed and JD the Truth Slayer were trending worldwide within minutes. Video clips of the exchange, shot on shaky cell phones from inside the ballroom, were being uploaded, shared, and replayed millions of times. Every frame was being dissected, every microexpression analyzed. Pence's trembling lip, Vance's unblinking stare, the folder landing on the podium. It was the kind of raw, unfiltered political drama that a nation addicted to conflict had been craving. The mainstream media, the very institutions Mike Pence had sought to appease, turned on him with the swift, merciless brutality of a wolf pack. Pundits who had hailed him as a hero of democracy just months before were now framing him as a tragic fallen figure, a man whose ambition had led him to a fatal miscalculation. They spoke of him in the past tense, as if he were already a political ghost. They didn't defend him. They analyzed his downfall with a detached clinical interest. Their praise from the past year revealed to be what it always was: a temporary tool, a convenient narrative, now to be discarded for a new, more exciting one. They had used him to wound Trump, and now that he was no longer useful, they were content to watch Vance finish him off. But the reaction in the heartland, in the small towns and forgotten cities that Vance had channeled, was something else entirely. It was not glee. It was not a celebration of a political takedown. It was a profound, collective sigh of relief. On front porches in Ohio, in diners in Pennsylvania, in church basements in Iowa, people watched the clips on their phones and they wept. They were tears of vindication. For years, they had felt a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal, a feeling that their leaders, even the ones who spoke their language, would ultimately abandon them for the comforts and rewards of the establishment. They had watched it happen time and time again. And tonight, they had watched someone finally say no. They had watched a man who came from their world, who understood their pain, stand on the biggest stage and refuse to play the game. He hadn't just defended Donald Trump, he had defended them. He had defended their sense of honor, their belief in loyalty, their deep-seated conviction that you do not abandon your own, no matter how hot the fire gets. He had taken their quiet, private grief and turned it into a public, righteous roar. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had transformed. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, somber energy. The folder sitting on the podium was like a sacred object, a testament to a truth that had been spoken at great cost. J.D. Vance stood still, letting the reality of what he had done settle over the room. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't grin or pump his fist. He looked burdened, like a man who had been forced to reveal a terrible family secret for the good of the family itself. His expression was heavy, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful gravity. He had not enjoyed this. He had simply believed it was necessary. Pence stepped back from the microphone, his movements slow and clumsy, like a man waking from a bad dream. His face was a pale, bloodless mask. His hand, which had been trembling, now went to his suit pocket, fumbling for something that wasn't there. A phone, a handkerchief, an escape. The bright stage lights, which moments ago had been his element, now felt like interrogation's lamps, hot and accusatory, exposing every flaw, every flicker of shame. A few senators seated near the front, men who had once considered Pence a friend and a mentor, now looked away. They couldn't bear to watch. They were embarrassed, not just for him, but by him. Even a prominent pastor from Indiana, a man who had been one of Pence's earliest and most vocal supporters, quietly folded his hands on the table in front of him and bowed his head, as if in prayer for a lost soul. Vance cleared his throat, the small sound amplified to a cannon shot in the silent room. "Mike," he said, and the use of his first name was now an act of almost unbearable pity. "You said I was a puppet, but puppets don't bring the truth to light. Traitors do everything they can to keep it buried." A woman in the front row, an older woman with kind eyes and a small American flag pin on her lapel, wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. She was a Gold Star mother. Her son had died in Afghanistan. She had voted for the Trump-Pence ticket twice, believing in their promise to put America first. Pence's actions after January 6th had felt like a personal betrayal to her, a dishonor to her son's sacrifice. Tonight she felt a sense of justice, a painful but necessary cleansing. Pence tried to speak one last time. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out was a broken, croaking whisper. This, this isn't fair. But J.D. Vance had only just begun to unearth the story that needed to be told. The folder was not the end. It was just the beginning. The public now saw Pence not as a man of principle, but as a hollowed-out politician who had been caught scheming. They saw Vance not as a Trump sycophant, but as a defender of the faith, a warrior for the forgotten. The perception had shifted, irrevocably. The old guard was fallen. A new one was rising from the ashes. Just as the weight of Pence's political demise seemed to settle permanently over the room, a new energy began to stir. It started not at the front of the stage, but at the very back of the ballroom. A murmur, a ripple of movement. Heads began to turn, one by one, then in entire sections, like a field of sunflowers turning toward a rising sun. The double doors at the main entrance, which had been closed, swung open with a quiet, authoritative push. And there, silhouetted for a moment against the brighter light of the grand foyer, stood a figure instantly recognizable to every single person in the room and to the millions watching around the world. President Donald J. Trump. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply stood there for a beat, letting his presence register, a living embodiment of the entire conflict that had just torn the room apart. The cameras, which had been locked in a tight, claustrophobic focus on the drama at the podium, now spun around with a mechanical whir, desperate to capture this new, monumental development. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals processing their own private shock, now became a single, unified body, its collective gaze fixed on the former, and perhaps future, leader of their movement. Mike Pence visibly tensed. If his posture had been one of defeat moments before, it now became one of pure, unadulterated dread. He looked like a man who, having just survived a shipwreck, now saw the dorsal fin of a great white shark cutting through the water towards him. He had been judged by the heir apparent. Now, he was about to be judged by the king himself. Slowly, with the deliberate, almost regal pace he had perfected over 1,000 rallies, Donald Trump began to walk down the center aisle. The space parted for him as if by an invisible force. People who had been standing to applaud Vance now stood even straighter, a mixture of awe and reverence on their faces. He wasn't just a politician walking into a room. He was a symbol walking through his temple. His face was a mask of grim resolve, unreadable, which only amplified the tension. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was observing, assessing, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the scene with the cool, appraising gaze of a general surveying a victorious but costly battlefield. J.D. Vance, who had commanded the room with his quiet strength, now turned towards the approaching figure. He did not look relieved or triumphant. He looked like a loyal soldier standing at attention for his commanding officer. He gave a single, sharp nod of respect as Trump drew near, a gesture of deference that was also a transfer of power. And then, he did something that spoke volumes about his character. He stepped aside. He physically moved away from the center of the podium, ceding the spotlight he had just so commandingly earned, making it clear that this moment was no longer about him. Trump reached the stage and stepped up, his movements fluid and confident. He walked to the podium, placed his hands on it, and looked out over the sea of faces. The silence in the room was now something entirely different. It was not the silence of shock or of a tomb. It was the silence of absolute anticipation. 1,000 hearts were beating in a single, suspended rhythm. He let the moment hang in the air for a full 10 seconds, a master of dramatic timing. Then, his gaze shifted, moving from the crowd to the man standing broken and isolated a few feet away. He looked at Mike Pence. It was not a look of anger or of hatred. It was a look of cold, profound disappointment, the look of a father regarding a son who had failed him in the most fundamental way. "You know," Trump began, his voice calm, almost conversational, yet amplified to fill every corner of the vast ballroom. "I've been watching from the side, and I have to say I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am of the man who just stood here." J.D. Vance's face remained a mask of calm resolve. There was no flicker of pride, no hint of a smile. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a duty that had been performed. Trump placed a hand on Vance's shoulder, a gesture of both endorsement and protection. "Loyalty," Trump said, his voice gaining strength, "is not blind obedience. Anyone who tells you that is trying to sell you something. Loyalty is having the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's ugly, especially when it hurts. Then Trump turned his full attention, his entire physical presence, toward Mike Pence. The weight of that gaze seemed to make Pence physically smaller. "I put my trust in you, Mike," Trump said, his voice now low and heavy with the weight of personal betrayal. "And you broke that trust, but that's not the worst part. You didn't just break my trust." He paused, letting the indictment build. "You broke the trust of every person in this room and every person in this country who believed in you." Pence looked away, unable to meet his eyes. He stared at the floor, at the exit, at anything but the face of the man he had once served. And then Trump delivered the line that would define the night, a line that was both a brutal condemnation and a perfect, poetic summation of the entire event. He glanced at Vance, then back at Pence. "You stood up here and you called JD a puppet," Trump said, a slight, mirthless smile touching his lips. "But what you failed to realize, Mike, is that tonight, he pulled your strings without ever laying a hand on you." The room broke. The carefully maintained dam of political decorum and stunned silence burst into 1,000 pieces. A roar went up from the crowd, a raw, visceral sound of catharsis and affirmation. It was a cheer not just for Trump or for Vance, but for the restoration of an order they believed in. Some people were shouting. Others were crying openly, tears of relief and vindication streaming down their faces. The room, which had been the site of a tense and painful confrontation, now belonged completely to J.D. Vance and the man who had anointed him. The torch had not just been passed. It had been ripped from a traitor's hand by a true believer. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that seemed to wash over Mike Pence, erasing what little was left of his public stature. He stood there, blinking rapidly, as if the sheer volume of his rejection was a physical assault. The camera flashes were relentless, a barrage of white light that captured his humiliation from every conceivable angle, preserving it for eternity. He was no longer a participant in the evening's events. He was a historical artifact, a monument to a bygone era of the party, now being publicly decommissioned. J.D. Vance had moved back to the podium, standing beside President Trump, not in front of him, a subtle but powerful visual of restored order. Trump's arm was still draped across his shoulders, a silent, unyielding statement of alliance. The room was packed, yet the focus had narrowed to these two men, the air around them electric. Every major news network in the world had now cut away from their regular programming. This was no longer just a political story. It was a national spectacle. YouTube streams were buckling under the traffic, the numbers spiking into the millions as clips went viral in real time. "America," JD began, his voice cutting through the fading applause, regaining command of the room with a renewed, somber authority. He looked past the audience into the unblinking eye of the center camera, speaking directly to the nation. "Our country isn't perfect. We've been bruised. We've been lied to by our media, by our institutions, and sometimes even by our own leaders." He did not look at Pence. He didn't have to. But no wound cuts deeper than betrayal from within. No pain is greater than the one inflicted by a man you once called a brother. Someone in the crowd, a man with a weathered face and calloused hands, choked back a sob. It was a raw, unguarded sound of grief that seemed to encapsulate the feelings of millions. "When a man," Vance continued, his voice low and steady, "chooses the polite applause of his enemies over the steadfast loyalty of his friends, he becomes smaller than his own shadow. He forfeits his right to lead." Pence turned his head, his eyes once again finding the exit doors at the back of the ballroom. They seemed a universe away. He was trapped in the spotlight, a prisoner of the moment he himself had created. He couldn't leave. Not yet. To flee now would be the final, ultimate admission of guilt. Vance lifted the manila folder from the podium again, holding it not as a weapon, but as a somber piece of evidence. "What is in this folder is not personal," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "It's painful, but it is necessary, because this country cannot begin to heal until we are willing to cleanse our own house of the people who helped the arsonists light the match." Tears were now falling freely throughout the room. The story was no longer just about Pence's political maneuvering. It had deepened into a parable about loyalty, betrayal, and the soul of a nation. As the weight of the moment settled, a new, unplanned interruption occurred. Near the side of the stage, a man in a wheelchair was being slowly, carefully rolled forward by a young woman, his teenage daughter. He was a veteran, his face etched with the lines of a hard life, his jaw set with a grim determination. J.D. Vance noticed him. He paused his speech, his attention immediately shifting from the cameras to the man. "Sir," Vance said, his voice softening with genuine respect, "it looks like you have something to say." He gestured for an aide to bring a microphone. The aide rushed a wireless mic to the man. He took it in a hand gnarled by age and hardship. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble weathered by time and pain. "I served this country for 30 years," he began, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Under 3 different presidents. I lost this leg in a dusty hellhole in Afghanistan." He gestured to his missing limb. "But I never, not once, lost my faith in this nation. Not until the day I watched Mike Pence certify that election and turn his back on President Trump." A fresh wave of gasps swept the room. He turned his head and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Pence. "You stood on stages and you talked to us about courage. You quoted the Bible. You told us to be strong. But when the real storm came, when the media and the whole damn swamp came for us, you ran for cover." Pence could not make eye contact. He stared at his own shoes as if they were the most fascinating objects in the world. The veteran turned his gaze back to J.D. Vance. "You," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "tonight you reminded me of a word I thought our leaders had forgotten: honor." J.D. blinked hard, his composure momentarily shaken. He had been prepared for a political fight, for attacks and counterattacks. He had not been prepared for this, for the raw, heartbreaking validation of a wounded warrior. The daughter placed a gentle hand on her father's shoulder. He took a deep, shuddering breath and whispered, "That's all I wanted to say." J.D. stepped back to the podium, his own voice quieter now, filled with a new depth of emotion. "America is not asking for perfect leaders," he said, his eyes finding the veterans. "She is begging for honest ones." Even some of Pence's oldest allies, men who had come here tonight intending to support him, were now bowing their heads in shame. What had started as a political fundraiser had become something far more profound. It was a national reckoning, a therapy session for a movement's broken heart. And at the center of it all was the raw, unvarnished truth, spoken not just by a politician, but through the tears and the testimony of the very people who had been betrayed. Mike Pence had always been a man of immense self-control. His public persona was a fortress built brick by brick over decades, with walls of discipline, faith, and carefully calculated speech. But now, under the relentless assault of Vance's truth, the weight of Trump's judgment, and the palpable grief of the people, the fortress began to crack. The mortar crumbled. The foundation gave way. "I tried," he finally muttered, the words barely audible, a desperate plea for understanding. He looked up, his eyes glassy with a film of unshed tears, searching the room for a single sympathetic gaze. "I tried to do what I thought was right." His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual confident timbre. I didn't mean for." "You didn't mean for what, Mike?" J.D. Vance cut in, his tone not aggressive but firm, the voice of a surgeon refusing to let a patient look away from his own wound. "You didn't mean to trade the truth for your own political safety. You didn't mean to hurt the millions of people who put their faith in you. You didn't mean to let the media establishment, the people who despise everything we stand for, write the final chapter of our administration." Pence's voice grew shaky, rising in pitch as his composure finally shattered completely. I didn't think he could win again." The admission, torn from the deepest, most pragmatic corner of his soul, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "I didn't want to go down with the ship." Silence, a dead, profound, damning silence. In that single panicked confession, he had validated every accusation. He had admitted that his stand on principle was, in fact, a political calculation, a bet, and he had bet against them. J.D. Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the remaining distance between them. He now stood directly in front of Pence, forcing the former vice president to look at him. He did not yell. He did not glower. He simply locked eyes with him, his gaze a mixture of profound disappointment and cold, hard finality. And that, Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence, is why you no longer belong here. Pence's lips trembled violently. He looked as if he might physically collapse. His eyes darted to Trump, who stood by the podium, his arms folded across his chest, his expression as hard and unforgiving as granite. There would be no rescue from that quarter. He turned his gaze toward the crowd, a last, desperate appeal to the jury, but they were no longer with him. They were a sea of cold, alienated faces. A few people in the front rows, donors who had known him for years, slowly stood up, turned their backs to the stage, and stood in silent, brutal protest. It was a gesture of excommunication, more powerful than any shout. J.D. Vance didn't celebrate the moment. He didn't smile or raise a triumphant fist. He looked down for a moment, as if gathering the strength to deliver the final, necessary eulogy. Then he leaned back into the microphone, his voice quiet, almost mournful. "Cowards," he said, the word resonating with the power of a biblical proverb, "run from the fire. Leaders walk through it for the people they serve." And at that moment, it wasn't just Mike Pence who had been exposed. It was the entire artifice of his political life. Every speech about courage, every invocation of faith, every claim to principled conservatism, it had all been reduced to a pile of ash, consumed by the fire he had refused to walk through. The man who had entered the room to reclaim his place in the party had instead been permanently cast out of it, not by a rival, but by the simple, unyielding force of the truth he had tried to hide. Outside the Capitol Grand Hall, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The news vans now lined the streets for blocks, their satellite dishes pointed to the sky like a strange metallic forest. Reporters, their faces illuminated by the bluish glow of their cell phones, shouted updates to their producers. The initial headlines of a confrontation had now escalated to something far more definitive. Pence's political career annihilated in live meltdown. Vance emerges as undisputed heir to Trump. The purge, new GOP draws line in the sand. Inside the hall, the main program had, for all intents and purposes, concluded. J.D. Vance was now seated in a large armchair on the stage, next to President Trump, in a hastily arranged question-and-answer session. Mike Pence had been quietly, almost invisibly, ushered to a seat in the shadows at the far edge of the front row, no longer a participant, but a spectator at his own wake. A reporter from a major conservative network, perched in the designated press box, shouted the first question. "Mr. Vice President Vance, after what we've witnessed tonight, do you believe there is still a place for Mike Pence in the Republican Party?" The room fell silent again, eager to hear the verdict. J.D. looked up, his expression thoughtful, his voice firm but measured. "I believe our party is long overdue for a season of accountability," he began, choosing his words with care. "Not the kind of accountability demanded by the left, but accountability from within. Accountability to our own principles and to our own voters." The crowd murmured its approval. He continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "We don't lose elections just because of the other side's lies or the media's bias. We lose them because of the quiet, polite betrayals that happen in our own ranks. We lose them when our leaders value a compliment from a CNN anchor more than the trust of a coal miner in West Virginia." He turned his head slightly, a brief, almost imperceptible glance in Pence's direction, before looking back at the press. "This was never about punishment. It's about purification. It's about protecting the soul of the conservative movement so that we don't wake up one day and find we've become the very people we swore to fight against." Pence sat in the shadows, a man erased. The light from the stage barely touched him. He looked down at his hands, turning them over and over as if seeing them for the first time. They were the hands that had shaken 1,000 other hands, signed bills into law, rested on the Bible as he took his oath of office. Now they just looked like the hands of a lonely, broken old man. And J.D. Vance. His name, his presence, was now rising like a storm that no one, least of all Mike Pence, had seen coming. As the formal event concluded and the ballroom began to empty, a strange and somber quiet descended. The air, once electric with tension and then explosive with catharsis, now felt heavy, thick with the finality of what had transpired. Mike Pence rose from his seat in the shadows. He moved slowly, stiffly, like a man twice his age. No one approached him. No one offered a comforting hand on his shoulder or a quiet word of sympathy. The power brokers and donors who had clamored for his attention just a few hours earlier now averted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by a text message on their phone or an acquaintance across the room. He had become invisible, a ghost haunting the scene of his own demise. He walked through the center aisle, the same path Trump had taken in his triumphant entrance. But for Pence, it was a walk of shame, a gauntlet of averted eyes and deliberate silence. People didn't move out of his way with respect. They simply leaned back in their chairs, creating a space around him, a quarantine zone of political contagion. He reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and paused for a single, heartbreaking moment. His hand rested on the brass handle. Perhaps he was hoping someone would call out his name, stop him, say something, anything, to lessen the crushing weight of his isolation. But there was only silence. The only sound was the distant, polite applause for a final speaker on stage. And in that silence, the weight of his regret, of his catastrophic miscalculation, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had gambled everything on the belief that the party would eventually tire of the fight, that they would crave a return to the quiet, respectable politics he represented. He had bet that civility would be valued more than loyalty, and he had lost everything. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the foyer, not into the glare of cameras, but into a cold, empty expanse. No microphones were thrust in his face. No reporters chased after him for a comment. The pack had moved on. He was old news. A chapter had ended brutally and publicly. And J.D. Vance's was now being written, not by politicians, but by the very people Pence had forgotten. Meanwhile, near the stage, Vance was surrounded. But it was not the usual scrum of reporters and political operatives. It was a slow, steady procession of ordinary people. They waited patiently, their faces etched with emotion, for a chance to speak to him, to touch his shoulder, to shake his hand. An old veteran in a worn leather jacket, his body stooped with age but his eyes bright and clear, stood waiting, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His lapel was a constellation of medals, silent testament to a life of service. Vietnam, Desert Storm, a Purple Heart. When J.D. finally reached him, the man didn't speak right away. He just looked into Vance's eyes, a long, searching gaze, as if trying to measure the depth of the man's soul. Then he slowly, deliberately held out a gnarled hand. "You spoke for us tonight, son," the old soldier said, his voice thick and shaking with an emotion he had likely suppressed for decades. "All of us who felt left behind. I've been waiting a long, long time to hear a man in Washington speak the truth like that again." J.D. gripped his hand firmly, his own throat tight. "It was an honor, sir. Thank you for your service." "No," the veteran replied, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes watering. "Thank you for finally serving us." He turned to walk away, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't you ever change. You hear me? This country can't afford to lose another real one." J.D. nodded, unable to speak, swallowing hard against the lump forming in his throat. He stood still for a moment, watching the old man limp slowly toward the exit. And then he saw it all around him. People were crying, not with the loud, performative grief of a political rally, but with the quiet, profound tears of people who had been given a reason to hope again. A young mother, holding a sleeping toddler on her hip, caught his eye and whispered, "That's our vice president." And for the first time all night, a small, genuine smile touched J.D. Vance's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of pride. It was a smile of immense, humbling gratitude. He didn't need the applause. He didn't need the headlines. He had their hearts. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was a far greater and far heavier prize. Backstage in a small, quiet holding room, the weight of the evening finally descended upon him. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound emotional and physical exhaustion. He sat down heavily on a small sofa, his shoulders slumping forward, and stared at the muted gray carpet. The door opened quietly and President Trump walked in, holding 2 bottles of water. He didn't speak, just handed one to J.D. and sat down beside him. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Trump spoke, his voice low and serious. "You didn't just defend me out there tonight, J.D.," he said, staring straight ahead. "You defended something much, much bigger than me." J.D. looked over, taking a slow sip of water. "I just told the truth, Mr. President." Trump let out a short, soft chuckle, a sound devoid of its usual bombast. "Yeah, but the truth isn't cheap. It costs something. You paid the price tonight." JD nodded slowly. It was worth it. Trump grew quiet again, then leaned in, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "They love you now, the people. They see you as one of them. Don't ever let that change you. Don't let the power, the attention, make you forget the look on that old soldier's face." JD looked him directly in the eye, his own gaze clear and unwavering. "I'm not in this for power, sir. I'm in this to make sure no kid ever has to grow up in a country that makes them feel ashamed of where they come from." Trump studied his face for a long moment, then placed a heavy hand on JD's back and stood up. "That," he said with a decisive nod, "is exactly why you're going to go farther than any of them." He walked out of the room, leaving JD alone with his thoughts. The night was over, but the fight had just begun. This moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something much bigger, much harder, and much more important than he could have ever imagined. By morning, the political landscape of America had been redrawn. The folder J.D. Vance had placed on the podium was not just a prop, it was a detonator. Scanned copies of the declassified emails and texts had been leaked to every major news outlet overnight. They were damning. They showed, in cold, inarguable black and white, a Mike Pence who was not a man agonizing over constitutional duty, but a shrewd political operator actively courting the favor and funding of the very people his base considered the enemy. There were emails with prominent Democrat strategists discussing rebranding the post-Trump GOP. There were text messages with heads of never-Trump PACs outlining potential speaking tour and media appearances designed to offer a more reasonable conservative alternative. The timeline was brutal, confirming Vance's claim that these conversations had begun just days after the chaos of January 6th, while the embers were still hot. The legal fallout was minimal. Pence had been careful not to cross any lines into outright criminality, but the political fallout was apocalyptic. The Republican National Committee, which had been cautiously keeping Pence in its orbit as a potential elder statesman, issued a terse, one-sentence statement before 9 a.m. The RNC is focused on the future of the party. It was a political execution. Major donors who had been funding Pence's nascent political operation began calling his chief of staff, one by one, to inform him that their support was being indefinitely suspended. His upcoming appearance on a major Sunday morning political show was abruptly canceled, the host's assistant citing a last-minute scheduling conflict. Mike Pence had vanished. He wasn't taking calls. His staff, or what was left of it, had no idea where he was. He had slipped out of the hotel in the pre-dawn hours, a man in a rumpled suit climbing into an unmarked black car, his face hidden from the single persistent photographer who had bothered to wait for him. He was a man not just in disgrace, but in exile, an exile of his own making. In a quiet, dimly lit diner somewhere in rural Virginia, he sat alone in a corner booth, a copy of the Washington Post on the table beside him. The headline screamed, "Pence Papers Reveal Shadow Campaign." He stared into a cup of black coffee, the bitter liquid untouched. He remembered the feeling of standing on that stage, the confidence, the righteous certainty. It felt like a memory from another man's life. The worst part was not the hatred from the MAGA base. He had expected that. It was the pitying, condescending tone of the articles in the very newspapers he had sought to appease. They treated him not as a fallen hero, but as a clumsy amateur who had been outmaneuvered. He hadn't just lost his party, he had lost his dignity. And he finally understood in the quiet hum of the diner that J.D. Vance hadn't destroyed him with anger. He had done it with truth. Calm, steady, unforgiving truth. Back in Washington, the opposite was happening. J.D. Vance was no longer just the vice president. He had become the de facto spiritual leader of the conservative movement. His office was inundated with calls, not just from politicians scrambling to declare their allegiance, but from grassroots organizers, from state party chairmen, from county commissioners. They all wanted one thing, for him to come and speak to their people. They didn't want a politician. They wanted the man who had spoken the truth. That morning, he was scheduled for a sit-down interview with the nation's most respected and feared political anchor, A woman named Corinne Dillard, known for her sharp intellect and her refusal to suffer fools. Millions tuned in, expecting fireworks. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her tone professional but laced with an undeniable curiosity. "Last night was one of the most extraordinary moments in modern political history. What was going through your mind when a man you once served alongside, former Vice President Mike Pence, stood up and publicly called you a puppet?" JD leaned back in his chair, his posture calm, his demeanor anything but triumphant. "Honestly, Corinne," he said, his voice quiet and clear, "my first feeling was sadness." The anchor raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Sadness, not anger." "No, sadness," he repeated. "Because I saw a man who had been given one of the greatest honors in this country, the chance to serve the American people alongside a truly great president. And I saw that man reduced to a vessel of bitterness and personal pride. He chose to chase the applause of the Georgetown cocktail circuit over his allegiance to the millions of forgotten men and women who trusted him. That's a tragedy, and it's worthy of sadness." Dillard nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the answer. "And the folder you produced. Critics are already calling it a calculated political assassination." "The truth is never an assassination," JD replied smoothly. "The truth is a disinfectant. The rot in our political system on both sides of the aisle thrives in the dark. It thrives on secret deals and whispered promises. I simply chose to turn on the lights. The American people can handle the truth. It's the politicians who hide from it that you have to worry about." The interview continued, but the narrative had been set. Online, the reaction was overwhelming. The hashtags "truth is a disinfectant" and "turn on the lights" began to trend. People were not just cheering for a political victory. They were embracing a new philosophy of leadership, one that valued transparency over empty rhetoric. When the interview ended, JD didn't go to a meeting with strategists or donors. He went home. He walked into his house in the quiet Virginia suburbs and was immediately tackled by his 8-year-old son. As he tucked the boy into bed that night, his son looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. "Daddy, some kids at school said that man on TV was right. They said you were just President Trump's puppet." JD froze, the question hitting him with more force than any attack from a political opponent. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Well, son," he said softly, "sometimes, when you stand up for a good person who is being attacked by bullies, the bullies and their friends try to call you names to make you feel weak. They call you a puppet to try and make you stop standing up for what's right." The boy's eyes welled up. "But you didn't yell at him. You weren't a bully back." JD smiled, a gentle, tired smile, and brushed the hair off his son's forehead. "Because real strength, buddy, doesn't have to scream. Real strength is just telling the truth, quietly and calmly, even when your voice is shaking." The boy threw his arms around his father's neck and hugged him tight. "You're my hero, Daddy." JD swallowed hard against the lump in his throat and kissed his son's head. "No, you're mine." As he stood in the doorway, watching his son drift to sleep, the weight of the past 24 hours settled on his shoulders. The political battles, the media frenzy, the praise, and the attacks, it all faded into the background. This was the reason he fought. For this little boy. For every child in America who deserved to grow up in a country where truth still mattered, where honor was more than just a word, and where leaders didn't run from the fire. And with that thought, he knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that he had to go back into the fight, because it had only just begun. In the days that followed, a quiet but profound shift occurred across the country. In a small-town classroom in Ohio, a 7th-grade civics teacher, Mrs. Langston, put away her standard textbook. Instead, she played the clip of J.D. Vance's speech for her students. The grainy video filled the room, the quiet intensity of his words silencing the usually restless class. When it was over, she turned to the students, her eyes misty. "All right," she said softly. "Forget the book for a minute. What did you feel when you watched that?" A young girl in the back, a shy student who rarely spoke, raised her hand. He made it feel like he was talking to my grandpa," she said. "Like he actually cared about normal people, not just politics." Another student, a boy whose father had been laid off from the local auto parts plant, added, "It felt real. Like he wasn't just reading words off a screen. He was mad about the same things my dad gets mad about. Mrs. Langston nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. That, she said, her voice thick with emotion, is what leadership is supposed to be. It's not about sounding the smartest or yelling the loudest. It's about having the courage to stand for something real, even when everyone else is telling you to sit down and be quiet. On the television screen, frozen on a close-up of Vance's determined face, the echo of his words seemed to linger in the air. Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it. In that small classroom, hundreds of miles from the Washington bubble, J.D. Vance was no longer just a vice president. He had become a lesson in courage, a symbol of a forgotten ideal. Back at the Capitol, the aftershocks were still reshaping the landscape. Lauren, J.D. Vance's chief of staff, knocked gently on his office door. "Come in," he said, looking up from a stack of briefing papers. She entered but didn't speak, her eyes red-rimmed. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something." J.D. stood, a look of concern on his face. "What's wrong, Lauren?" She sat down, clutching a tissue in her hand. "I used to work for him," she confessed, the words spilling out in a rush. "For Pence. I was a junior staffer on his gubernatorial campaign. I believed in him. I defended him to my family even after he turned his back on President Trump. I kept making excuses." J.D. remained silent, listening with a patient intensity. "But after what you did," she said, pausing to steady her voice, "after you stood up there and spoke the truth that so many of us were too afraid to even whisper, you reminded me why I got into this work in the first place. It wasn't for a title or a career. It was to fight for the people I grew up with." She wiped a tear from her eye. "You didn't just expose a man, sir. You healed something that was broken in a lot of us." J.D. walked over and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We've all put our faith in the wrong people at some point, Lauren. What matters is that we have the courage to find our way back to the truth." "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "It was worth it." Outside his office, other staff members moved with a new sense of purpose. The cynicism that so often permeates Washington had been replaced by a quiet, fervent belief. They weren't just working for a politician anymore. They were soldiers in a cause. Later that night, J.D. was summoned to the Oval Office. He found President Trump standing by the resolute desk, looking out the window at the South Lawn, bathed in the soft glow of the evening lights. He didn't turn around when J.D. entered. "It was a masterpiece, J.D.," Trump said, his voice unusually subdued. "Thank you, Mr. President," Vance replied, approaching slowly. Trump finally turned, and J.D. stopped in his tracks. The president's eyes were wet. The man famous for his impenetrable toughness, for his refusal to show weakness, had tears in his eyes. "You reminded me of something tonight," Trump said, his voice heavy with a rare vulnerability. "Something I think even I was starting to forget in all the noise and all the fighting, that this isn't about us. It's not about me, it's not about you." He gestured toward the window, toward the unseen country beyond. "It's about them, the forgotten ones, the ones who work with their hands and pray on their knees, the heartland." J.D. lowered his head respectfully. "They just need someone who won't abandon them when the fight gets hard." "And last night," Trump said, his voice regaining its strength, "they found him." The two men stood in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them that was deeper than politics. It was a bond forged in a common love for a country they both felt was slipping away. And for the first time in a long, long time, the White House didn't feel like a political fortress under siege. It felt like home. As the nation rallied around its new conservative hero, a final, quiet scene played out. An envelope hand-delivered by a mail clerk was placed on J.D.'s desk. It was marked urgent, but had no return address, just a child's name scrawled in blue ink, Mason H., age 11, Nebraska. J.D. opened it. The handwriting was crooked, the spelling imperfect, but the words were a dagger to the heart. "Dear Mr. Vance," it began. "My dad used to be a big Mike Pence guy. We had his sign in our yard. But after he was mean to President Trump, my dad got real sad. He said he didn't have anyone to believe in anymore. Yesterday, we watched you on the news. My dad cried. I only ever saw him cry when my dog died. He said you reminded him of what it means to be a real American. He said he feels proud again. Thank you for being brave when the other guys were scared. You are not a puppet, you are a lion. Sincerely, Mason." JD folded the letter slowly, carefully, and held it to his chest. There were no cameras. There was no audience, but tears filled his eyes and streamed down his face. This, this was why he fought. Not for the power, not for the headlines, not for history, but for Mason, for Mason's dad, for every forgotten voice in every forgotten town who was just waiting, praying for someone to finally tell the truth. The future had arrived, and its name was J.D. Vance. If this story moved you, if it gave you a reason to hope, please hit that like button. If you believe, as we do, that truth and courage are what this country needs, subscribe to the channel right now and share this story with just one person who has lost faith. Let's remind America what it means to be brave together.